The first time I felt the water close around me in the black lagoon, I swore I heard breathing that wasn't mine. The surface looked calm from above, but below was a darkness so thick it felt alive, pressing against my mask, tugging at my fins, whispering in ways I couldn't explain. They told me there were 9 rules I had to follow if I wanted to survive the dives here, rules written long before I joined the crew. At first I laughed, thinking they were just sailor stories meant to scare rookies, until I watched someone break one. I still remember the sound of his regulator hissing, then silence, as the water swallowed him whole. I've never stopped wondering if he drowned, or if something else claimed him. The sky was bruised with deep purple when I first learned that Rule 1, never enter the lagoon after sunset, no matter the circumstances, was not a suggestion. I stood on the edge of the lagoon, watching the water shimmer with the last light of day, feeling the pull beneath the surface that seemed almost alive. I remember thinking the rule was exaggeration. How dangerous could this water be if the sun was still fading? But the first time I hesitated at the shoreline, the temperature dropped sharply, as though the water itself had decided I wasn't welcome. My heartbeat accelerated, and I could feel the lagoon shifting in subtle, unnatural ways, almost as if it were breathing. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that it was just nerves, that these were the tales veterans told to scare new divers. But I couldn't ignore the stories of those who had ignored Rule 1. One of the rookies had sneaked in once, just to prove he wasn't afraid, and the senior diver found him hours later, staring blankly at the water, unable to speak. When I asked what happened, the veteran only shook his head and muttered, "The lagoon doesn't forgive." It wasn't just a rule, it was a boundary drawn by something far older and more calculating than any of us. On that evening, I felt a strange tension in the air, thick and sticky, as I adjusted my gear. Every ripple on the lagoon's surface looked like a shadow. Every reflection in the fading light seemed to twist into a shape that shouldn't exist. I reminded myself of Rule 1, repeating it under my breath as if saying it aloud could keep me safe. I tested the water with my hand, and it recoiled slightly, like it recognized me, like it had memory. Something moved beneath the surface, fast, too fast for my eyes to follow, and I realized the lagoon was waiting, always watching for anyone foolish enough to ignore its limits. Even the routine checks we performed were fraught with tension. I remember following my usual path along the wooden dock, the planks creaking under my boots, shadows stretching long and unnatural across the water. Rule 1 echoed in my mind, a mantra and a warning: never enter after sunset. My partner, a skeptic named Harris, chuckled at my caution, saying, "It's just water, you'll be fine." But his voice trembled slightly when the surface erupted with a sudden swirl, sending mist into the air. I wanted to tell him that breaking Rule 1 didn't just put one diver at risk, it changed the lagoon, made it aware, and it never forgot. That first night I spent just observing, staying dry and letting my curiosity clash with my fear. I saw shapes moving beneath the surface, shadows that didn't belong, like fish but impossibly large and wrong, their eyes glowing faintly in the dying light. I understood then why Rule 1 existed. The lagoon was a predator that used darkness as a weapon. Even the smallest mistake could cost you, and the water remembered everything. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the lagoon seemed to swell with intent, and I shivered at the thought of what would happen if I stepped in. The warning was simple, but the consequences were anything but. By the time night fully claimed the sky, I had memorized every subtle ripple, every sound, every flicker of movement. I repeated Rule 1 in my mind constantly, imagining the rookie who had ignored it, the vacant expression he wore when they found him. The lagoon's darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living thing, a presence that waited for the bold or foolish. Harris argued that rules were made by humans, not water, but I could see it in his eyes. Even he was afraid to test the boundary. And then in the stillness, a low current brushed against my leg, gentle at first, then urgent, like a warning, reminding me why Rule 1 existed in the first place. The night grew colder, the air heavier, and I felt that itch of dread under my skin. The lagoon watching, always watching. I kept my flashlight trained on the far edge, scanning for signs of life, but the water didn't obey logic. It twisted shadows, turned the familiar into something alien, and I thought of the rookie again, thinking of how he laughed at the rules, thinking of the silence that followed his defiance. Rule 1 wasn't about time, it was about survival, about respecting boundaries that had been carved by something we couldn't understand. I stayed until dawn, refusing to step a toe into the water, and when the first light broke the horizon, the lagoon's surface seemed almost calm, but I knew it was only waiting. Even after the sun rose, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lagoon was aware of my presence, evaluating, remembering. Rule 1 had saved me that night, but it was only the first of 9, and I knew the others were waiting for me to make mistakes, to let my curiosity break the fragile barrier between safety and the unknown. I wanted to speak to Harris about it, but words felt heavy and insufficient, and I realized some things could not be explained, only obeyed. I packed up silently, leaving the edge of the water with a new understanding. The lagoon's patience was endless, but my own would not last if I ignored its rules. By the time I left the dock, dawn painting the lagoon in pale gold, I whispered Rule 1 to myself once more. It wasn't a habit, it was a lifeline, and deep inside, I wondered how long before someone else broke it, and what would the lagoon demand in return. I glanced back one last time, water still and silent for now, but I knew that silence was not peace. It was a waiting, a hunger, a memory that never faded. I didn't know yet what the next rule would test, but I felt certain that breaking any of them would be far more terrifying than I could imagine. The morning after surviving Rule 1, I returned to the lagoon with a sense of unease that wouldn't leave me. The sun's rays made the water glitter deceptively, hiding the true depths below. Harris joined me, still skeptical but quieter now, as if witnessing the lagoon's subtle warnings had dampened his bravado. I could feel my nerves straining against my own curiosity, the memory of shapes that shifted in the dark haunting me. I reminded myself repeatedly that Rule 2 never touch anything that moves on its own in the lagoon. No matter how small existed for a reason, movement that wasn't natural could mean anything, and anything down here could kill. The first time I encountered it, I thought it was a trick of light. A small glimmering shape floated near the reeds, swaying as though caught in a gentle current. But there was no wind, no visible cause for the motion. My instincts screamed at me to stay back, yet my eyes were drawn closer, mesmerized. Rule 2 echoed in my mind as I crouched near the water's edge, telling myself that curiosity would be my undoing if I acted recklessly. I watched the object twitch and pulse in a way that seemed alive, like it had a heartbeat, and I wondered if the lagoon itself was testing me. Harris, impatient and still testing boundaries, leaned forward and reached out. "It's just debris," he said, but his hand trembled slightly. "Probably a fish or some floating plant." I grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, "Don't. Remember Rule 2. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I saw doubt, fear, recognition. The movement increased, responding to our presence, and suddenly, the glimmering object leapt, or at least it felt that way, and disappeared beneath the water with a speed that made my stomach drop. The current seemed to shiver as though it had swallowed a secret, and I realized the lagoon wasn't just watching, it was judging. We spent hours near the edge, eyes scanning for anything else that defied explanation. Every shadow that shifted unnaturally made me freeze, repeating Rule 2 silently as a prayer. The water seemed alive in ways that couldn't be quantified, moving without wind or tide, pushing things along paths that didn't make sense. I noticed my own reflection twitch strangely in the surface, my face elongating, then snapping back, and I almost screamed. Harris muttered about hallucinations, but I knew better. The lagoon was shaping reality, testing our respect for its rules. Even the smallest deviation could have consequences, and I could feel them in the pit of my stomach. By midday, the sun was high, but the water's surface betrayed no calmness. A branch floated near the center, drifting lazily at first, but then jerking violently toward us. I froze, recalling Rule 2, while Harris stepped forward despite my warnings. "It's fine," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The branch twisted and seemed to twist around itself, impossible angles forming beneath the surface. I grabbed Harris and pulled him back, heart pounding, convinced that if he broke the rule, the lagoon would punish us both. Then, without warning, the branch vanished beneath the water, leaving nothing but a sudden stillness that felt heavier than the weight of fear itself. I realized then that Rule 2 wasn't just about avoiding danger. It was about avoiding engagement with intelligence that we couldn't comprehend. Objects moved with purpose, almost as if they were extensions of the lagoon's will. A small fish darted in patterns that seemed like signals, and I forced myself to look away. I remembered the rookie from the old tales, the one who had broken Rule 1, and the stories whispered about how the lagoon manipulated its prey. The thought of touching something that moved on its own filled me with dread. I couldn't shake, and yet curiosity clawed at me like a living thing, insisting I look closer. Harris finally admitted he had seen it too. Movement that didn't make sense. Objects moving without current, shape shifting faster than any fish could. He didn't want to touch them, but the skepticism in his eyes fought with fear. I kept reminding him of Rule 2, telling him it wasn't about bravery, it was about survival. "Even small things," I said, "can decide who leaves this lagoon alive." He nodded silently, a rare sign of agreement, and we maintained a careful watch, both of us feeling eyes on us from the water's depths, following, studying, testing. Hours passed with tense observation, until I noticed a shadow beneath a floating log. It moved deliberately, almost cautiously, sliding under the water, then reappearing as if it were breathing. I could sense it studying us as much as we were studying it. My heart pounded, and Rule 2 became a mantra in my mind. Do not touch, do not interfere, do not test. The log floated closer, twisting unnaturally with the currents, but I didn't reach for it. The fear of breaking the rule, of provoking something that could manipulate the water to consume us, kept me frozen. Harris didn't speak, but I could see his hands tightening on his gear, the tension mirrored in every muscle of his body. By late afternoon, the lagoon seemed almost calm, but the memory of movement that wasn't natural refused to leave my mind. Every ripple hinted at intelligence, every shadow suggested intent. I thought about the others who had ignored Rule 2 over the years, vanishing without a trace, and I shivered. "I don't think it's just water," Harris whispered finally, almost to himself. "It knows when you look at it. It responds." I nodded silently, realizing that obeying the rules wasn't just about keeping yourself safe. It was about not giving the lagoon reason to act. The knowledge settled like a stone in my chest. If we touched even one moving thing, we would pay. As the sun began to sink, painting the lagoon in dying gold, I noticed a small ripple near the reeds, moving against the current. I stiffened, Rule 2 echoing in my mind, louder than ever. Harris took a step back, his eyes wide, and we both held our breath. The water shifted, almost breathing, before a shape emerged, hovering just beneath the surface. I wanted to look away, but my curiosity burned, threatening to break the rule, to make me reach out and see. And then, as if acknowledging our hesitation, the water drew back into itself, leaving a void so empty it felt alive, reminding me why Rule 2 was written, and why the lagoon demanded obedience above all else. The next morning, the lagoon glimmered deceptively under the sun, calm and almost inviting after the tension of Rule 2. Harris and I prepared our gear, checking every line, every gauge, every regulator, knowing that Rule 3 never dived below the marked depth lines. No matter what you hear or see, existed to keep us from drowning in the unknown. The marked depth lines stretched along the lagoon floor, simple buoys tethered to stakes, but they were more than markers. They were warnings etched into memory. "Don't even think about it," I muttered to myself, staring at the deepening water beyond the last line, where shadows pooled unnaturally. Even the air felt heavier near that boundary, as though the lagoon exhaled through the depths, testing our resolve. Harris, still skeptical but quieter now, fiddled with his fins and asked, "What if there's something down there worth seeing?" I tightened my grip on my tank, heart hammering, recalling the stories of divers who ignored Rule 3 and never returned. "You mean like the guy in the Tales," I said quietly, "who went past the lines and didn't come back?" He laughed nervously, but the sound didn't reach his eyes, and I knew he feared the same thing I did. The water itself was alive, and the deeper you went, the more aware it became of you. The rules weren't arbitrary, they were survival etched into the souls of those who came before. We descended slowly, following the safe path within the marked lines, but the deeper we went, the more the water seemed to thicken, pressing against us with invisible hands. Every bubble from my regulator looked distorted, twisting upward in spirals that didn't obey physics. I remembered Rule 3, whispering it like a lifeline, as shapes drifted near the limits of visibility, hovering just beyond the safety of the markers. The lagoon seemed to hum softly, a low vibration that traveled through the water and into my bones. I had learned that sound, or the lack of it, was often more dangerous than motion, and every instinct screamed at me not to step past the boundaries. Even the smallest deviation from the marked depth line caused my pulse to spike. A shadow glided past, larger than any fish, silent, deliberate, and I forced myself to look away, repeating Rule 3 like a mantra. Harris, curious despite the warning, nudged slightly beyond the line, and I felt the water change instantly, currents tightening, dragging us toward the shadow. I grabbed his arm, yelling, "Stop, Rule 3 exists for a reason." The shape lingered beneath him, waiting, and I realized the lagoon didn't punish immediately. It calculated, prepared, and when the moment was right, it would strike. Time stretched as we hovered, suspended in water that seemed alive with intent. The buoy marking the safe depth line swayed slightly, like a sentinel, reminding us that rules existed for our lives. I watched Harris inch closer again, as if testing fate, and my chest tightened with a premonition I couldn't ignore. Rule 3 wasn't just a limit, it was a boundary against something conscious, something that lived below the measured safety. I gripped the line tethered to the buoy, the only anchor between me and the unseen intelligence lurking just beyond the light, and prayed silently that Harris would listen before curiosity destroyed him. A sudden shimmer passed through the water below, a flash of movement that made my stomach twist. I felt the urge to dive, to see what was down there, but the words of Rule 3 slammed into my mind. Never dive below the marked depth lines. My body froze, muscles coiled, and the lagoon seemed to pulse in response, almost taunting me with glimpses of what waited. Harris, mesmerized, reached out toward the shadow, his fingers trembling, and I lunged to stop him, feeling the current change violently around us. The water had shifted without wind or tide, and I realized the rule wasn't just guidance. It was a shield against the unknown predator that lived in darkness. Minutes passed like hours as we hovered just above the forbidden zone, both of us silent, aware of every motion in the water. Shapes swirled just beyond the depth line, twisting unnaturally, almost as if they were bait, luring the foolish or greedy. I repeated Rule 3 in my head, imagining the rookie from the stories, imagining the emptiness where he should have been, consumed by the depths after breaking the rule. The lagoon held secrets that none of us could understand, but the rules were designed to protect us from them. Crossing the line wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. Suddenly a tug on my leg nearly made me scream. A small object, moving of its own volition, brushed against my fin, and I remembered Rule 2 as sharply as I remembered Rule 3. Harris looked at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's just a fish, right?" I shook my head, voice low, warning, "No. Rule 3 and Rule 2 exist together. Don't touch it, don't go near it." The water around us churned slightly, and I could feel the lagoon testing our obedience, measuring our fear. I realized then that the rules weren't separate, they were interdependent, layers of protection that had to be respected simultaneously. As we started our ascent back to the shallower zones, I felt a sudden pressure behind me, a tug that wasn't current, not wind, not anything natural. Rule 3 screamed in my mind, never below the marked depth lines. I glanced over my shoulder to see a shadow flicker, just beneath the line we had hovered above, stretching impossibly long and thin. Harris swallowed hard and clutched my arm, eyes wide with terror, and I felt a cold certainty that the lagoon remembered our movements, catalogued them, and would punish any deviation. The current shifted again, insistent, almost angry, as if reminding us that we had survived this encounter only because we obeyed. By the time we broke the surface, gasping and shivering, the lagoon seemed deceptively calm again, almost placid in the morning sun. But I knew better. Rule 3 had been tested, and we had passed only because fear had anchored our respect. I watched the water ripple subtly, a reminder that the rules were alive, and that breaking even one would invite consequences far beyond human comprehension. Harris avoided my gaze, silent, humbled, and I realized that the rest of the rules, 6 more in total, would test us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. Something in me knew the next one would push even deeper into the lagoon's intelligence, and I felt a tightening in my chest at the thought. Rule 4. Never let the lagoon's reflections fool you. They are never your own. The sun was setting again, painting the lagoon in shades of molten gold, when I realized just how dangerous Rule 4 could be. I leaned over the edge, staring at my reflection shimmering on the water, and noticed it twitch in ways my body did not. My heart thumped painfully, and I remembered the countless warnings from veterans the lagoon did not mirror reality. It twisted it. Harris, standing beside me, glanced down and froze, eyes widening as his own reflection seemed to smile when he did not. I grabbed his shoulder urgently, whispering, "Don't trust it. Rule 4 exists for a reason." I tried to convince myself. It was a trick of light, a natural refraction, but deep down I knew better. The reflections in the black lagoon were cunning, purposeful, and deceptive, often imitating those who dared to stare too long. I could see shadows moving behind the mirrored image of myself, shapes that didn't exist in the real water. Rule 4 pulsed in my mind as a warning. What you see is never trustworthy, and curiosity could be fatal. I reminded Harris repeatedly, but he still tried to peer into the water, drawn by the lure of his reflection. As we adjusted our positions, I noticed the lagoon seemed to shimmer differently around us, as if aware we were observing it too closely. My reflection leaned forward, echoing every movement, but then it paused, grinned, and lingered in a way my face never did. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the edge, repeating Rule 4 like a lifeline. The water below rippled unnaturally, and the reflections of the reeds and trees stretched and warped, twisting into grotesque shapes. I realized with terror that the lagoon didn't just reflect, it manipulated, creating images to provoke fear, hesitation, and mistakes. Harris whispered that he saw something behind my reflection, something that slithered along the surface, but I couldn't confirm it. The mirror-like water seemed to hold a consciousness, aware of our attention and responding to it. Rule 4 was clear: never let yourself be fooled by these images. Yet my own fear made it difficult to look away. The lagoon's surface became a stage, a theater of distorted reality, showing us visions that were both alluring and horrifying. Every twitch of the reflection felt like a challenge, daring us to step closer, to lose ourselves. We moved cautiously along the shoreline, the golden light fading into purples and blues, but the reflections remained unnervingly active. My own eyes betrayed me, seeing motions that did not exist, as if the lagoon was taunting me. I reminded myself over and over, obey Rule 4, never trust the reflection. Harris, now pale and trembling, murmured, "It's following me," and I realized the rule applied to both of us equally. The lagoon's reflections were sentient, feeding on attention, measuring fear, and punishing those who lingered too long. The more we stared, the closer it felt, like an invisible hand testing our resolve. As the night deepened, a faint figure appeared in the water, like a twin of me, perfectly synchronized at first, then breaking into motions I didn't make. The lagoon's surface rippled in response, creating illusions that almost pulled me in. Rule 4 shouted in my mind, never trust them, never mimic them, never engage. I felt the tug of curiosity, that dangerous pull that made so many divers break the rules before me. My instincts screamed to retreat, but Harris froze, captivated by a reflection that seemed alive, almost whispering, luring him toward the edge. I had to drag him back with all my strength, knowing that one wrong glance could mean losing him, or both of us. The water seemed to breathe under the fading light, reflections shimmering with shapes that didn't exist. I watched the mirrored surfaces of the reeds twist into hands, faces, creatures I didn't recognize, all moving in perfect opposition to reality. Rule 4 felt alive in my chest, a shield against the trickery that waited for those who weren't vigilant. Harris muttered, voice shaking, I think it wants us to look, and I pressed my palms against his shoulders, whispering with urgency. Don't, that's exactly what it wants. Rule 4 is for this reason. The lagoon's surface undulated, teasing us, showing us impossible sights, testing our obedience. By the time the moon rose over the horizon, the lagoon seemed to settle, its surface deceptively calm again, yet I knew it was only patient. Every reflection was waiting, remembering, planning the next time it could ensnare a diver's gaze. Rule 4 had been our salvation that night, and I understood why the previous divers had vanished. The reflections were predators in disguise, exploiting attention and fear. I pulled Harris back toward the dock, eyes never leaving the water, feeling the lagoon's awareness follow us with each step. Something whispered in the back of my mind, a subtle warning that the next rule would test us even deeper, and that breaking it could cost more than just fear. The night after surviving Rule 4, I stayed near the dock, listening to the water ripple under the moonlight, and felt the first faint whisper brush against my thoughts. At first it sounded like the wind, or maybe the soft lapping of water, but as I strained to hear, I realized the sound was deliberate, patterned, almost like someone was calling my name. I froze, heart hammering, and reminded myself of Rule 5. Never respond to the lagoon's whispers, no matter how familiar or urgent they sound. Never respond, never answer, no matter how convincing it seemed. Harris glanced at me nervously, whispering, "Did you hear that?" And I shook my head, pulling him back, knowing that acknowledgement alone could give the lagoon an opening. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, that fear was amplifying every natural sound into words. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving through the rustle of the reeds. They mimicked voices I knew, faint echoes of past divers' tones, friendly and familiar, yet wrong in subtle ways that sent chills down my spine. Rule 5 repeated in my mind like a lifeline. I had heard tales of divers who responded, who thought they recognized a friend or a loved one in the lagoon's call, only to vanish, swallowed silently by the water, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their last words. Harris, curious despite the danger, whispered again, It sounds like my brother." My chest tightened. I gripped his arm and pulled him closer, forcing both of us to focus on reality instead of the phantom calls. Rule 5 screamed at me, warning that the lagoon's whispers were designed to ensnare, to manipulate, to lure anyone desperate enough to answer. The voices wove through the darkness beneath the dock, each syllable crafted to exploit fear, hope, and longing. My mind spun with the knowledge that even a single whispered response could change everything, drawing the lagoon's attention like a predator, zeroing in on movement. The whispers began to escalate, threading into our thoughts, mimicking fragments of memories and private conversations. I felt an unnatural familiarity, like the lagoon was probing the deepest parts of my mind, and I forced myself to look away from the water's surface. Rule 5 pulsed in my chest, a stark reminder that acknowledging the whispers could be fatal. Harris froze, trembling, and I realized that even fear itself could betray us. The moment we reacted emotionally, the lagoon would know exactly how to exploit it. The night air seemed thicker, denser, as if the lagoon's presence extended above the water, pressing down on us with unrelenting intent. I gripped my equipment tighter, scanning the water, straining for movement beyond the whispers, and the lagoon seemed to respond, carrying the sounds closer, more insistent. My own name echoed faintly among the voices, and I had to resist the urge to reply. Rule 5 was no longer just a guideline. It was a boundary that kept survival possible. Harris clenched his fists, whispering, "Maybe if I call back," and I shook him violently, my voice sharp. "No, that's exactly what it wants." Rule 5. The lagoon pulsed beneath us, almost like a heartbeat, as if acknowledging our restraint, testing whether fear could override reason. Hours passed with the whispers growing louder, cycling through tones of urgency, desperation, and familiarity. Shadows glided beneath the water, aligning with the echoes, as if the lagoon itself were orchestrating a performance to trick us. Every instinct screamed to respond, but I repeated Rule 5 like a mantra, focusing on keeping my mind tethered to reality. I thought of past divers, lost to the same manipulation, and my chest tightened as I imagined their terror in the final moments before the water consumed them. Obedience was survival, hesitation, even curiosity was death. As the moon reached its peak, the whispers shifted, turning almost pleading, soft and intimate. I felt the cold fingers of fear brushing my spine, tugging at my concentration, but I refused to answer. Rule 5 became a shield, each repetition anchoring me to my body and senses. Harris shook violently beside me, whispering broken fragments of encouragement to himself, yet I knew that answering, even with a whisper, would summon consequences far worse than silence. The lagoon's water seemed to shimmer, acknowledging our obedience, while simultaneously plotting the next test, as if it waited for the slightest falter in our discipline. By dawn, the lagoon settled into deceptive calm, the whispers retreating, but never disappearing entirely. I looked at Harris, who was pale and trembling, and realized that obeying Rule 5 had been a battle of mind and will, not just of physical restraint. The lagoon had tested us, and we had survived, but it had also reminded us that attention, curiosity, or even hope could be weaponized. I knew, deep down, that the next rule would force us even closer to the water's intent, and that the whispers we resisted tonight were merely the beginning of its strategies. Every rule interlocked with the others, and failure to honor one could unravel them all. The morning after surviving the whispers, I approached the lagoon with a growing unease, aware that Rule 6 never ignored the lagoon's temperature changes. Sudden warmth or cold as a warning could strike at any moment. The water near the dock seemed calm, almost inviting, yet my senses screamed otherwise. I dipped a gloved hand into the surface and immediately recoiled. The temperature shifted abruptly, colder than the early morning air. I whispered Rule 6 to myself, feeling the weight of the rule as the chill crawled up my arm. Harris, already uneasy from the previous night, glanced at me nervously, and I could see him noticing the change too, though neither of us could explain why the water suddenly felt alive. I had learned from old logs that the lagoon's temperature could signal presence, intent, or movement below the surface. A sudden warm patch could mean something was circling, waiting, calculating. A cold spike often preceded a violent current or unnatural ripple. I repeated Rule 6 in my head as I adjusted my gear, carefully scanning the water for anomalies. Harris leaned over, whispering, "It's just the sun hitting it, right?" I shook my head, voice low. "No, it's the lagoon. The water itself tells you when something is wrong. Rule 6 is not optional." By midday, the lagoon seemed to oscillate between extremes. Patches of icy water slid against my legs, followed by sudden warm pockets that made my skin crawl. I could feel the subtle tug of the current, guiding us toward areas we had been warned to avoid. Rule 6 pulsed in my mind: never ignore these shifts. The water wasn't random. It was aware, alive, and communicating in ways only those who survived could recognize. Harris flinched at each change, and I gripped his arm, silently forcing him to respect the warning. The lagoon was teaching us patience and vigilance, and breaking that lesson could be fatal. As I waded deeper, the temperature shifted violently beneath me. Cold like knives pressed against my thighs, followed instantly by a warmth that licked my chest. I gasped and forced myself to focus, repeating Rule 6 silently. Shadows beneath the surface moved in rhythm with the changes, a silent dance of predator and prey. Harris whispered, trembling, "It feels like it's watching us," and I nodded, feeling the same undeniable awareness. The lagoon's temperature wasn't just environmental, it was a message, a threat, a test of our attentiveness. Any hesitation, any misstep, could mean being claimed. The pattern continued, unpredictable yet purposeful, and I realized that the lagoon measured more than fear. It measured control. I had to resist the instinct to retreat or panic, keeping calm while every shift screamed danger. Rule 6 became my anchor, a rule not of comfort, but of survival. Harris nearly stepped into a sudden warm current that pulsed around him, and I grabbed his shoulder, warning, "Don't move. Remember Rule 6. The warmth receded like it had never been, leaving a shadowed ripple in its wake. I could feel the lagoon's awareness, almost like fingers brushing against my mind, testing whether we truly respected its rules. By evening, the temperature stabilized just enough for us to feel safe near the dock, yet I knew it was only temporary. The lagoon's pulse continued beneath the surface, a constant reminder that nothing here was static. Rule 6 had guided us through its subtle communications, but I could sense that the next rule would demand even more: obedience, intuition, and absolute focus. Harris and I retreated to shore silently, understanding that disobedience, even hesitation, had consequences far worse than simple fear. The lagoon watched, waiting for the next mistake, and I could feel it planning, calculating, learning from us. After surviving the temperature shifts of Rule 6, I realized the lagoon wasn't just testing my senses, it was testing our bonds. The moment I considered entering alone, a cold dread crept up my spine, warning me of the danger. I couldn't ignore Rule 7. Never dive alone. The lagoon preys on isolation. No diver should ever venture into the lagoon without a companion. Harris and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken understanding clear: we were each other's lifeline, and the water would punish any breach of this rule without mercy. The first dive of the day reinforced my fear. The lagoon seemed calm at first, but as we moved deeper, I noticed subtle currents forming around us, nudging us apart, testing our attention. Shadows flickered beyond the edge of vision, and I kept my hand on Harris's tank, unwilling to let him drift even a foot away. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. Isolation was death here. Even a momentary separation could mean being surrounded, hunted, or worse, taken by the darkness beneath. Harris, trying to lighten the tension, joked nervously, "So, it really hates solo divers?" I didn't answer, instead focusing on the flicker of movement at the bottom of the lagoon. Every instinct screamed that the lagoon could sense fear and vulnerability, and Rule 7 wasn't just guidance, it was a safeguard against its awareness. I could feel the water closing in slightly as we navigated, currents tightening subtly whenever either of us strayed too far from the other. The lagoon knew we were alone only in thought, and that thought alone could trigger its hunt. As we swam along the marked paths, I noticed a ripple forming near Harris, small at first, then growing with intent. It felt deliberate, almost predatory, like the lagoon was reaching for him. I tightened my grip on his shoulder and whispered, "Stay with me. Rule 7 isn't just a rule, it's survival." His eyes widened as he glanced at the darkening depths, finally understanding the weight of what I was saying. Every diver who had ignored Rule 7 had vanished alone, leaving nothing but memories of their screams carried on the water. Deeper into the lagoon, currents began pulling in opposite directions, subtly tugging at each of us, threatening to separate us. I could hear faint whispers echoing in the depths, mimicking voices we trusted, urging us apart. Rule 7 pulsed in my chest like a drum, a constant warning: never let the water isolate you. I adjusted our path carefully, moving as one, eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong. The lagoon seemed aware of our unity, and pressed harder, almost testing whether we could maintain it under pressure. Suddenly a shadow darted between us, moving faster than anything in the water should, attempting to wedge itself into the gap. I clutched Harris's arm, shouting, "Stay with me. Rule 7. The water shifted violently as the shadow passed, leaving behind a chilling calm, a reminder of how close we had come to breaking the rule. My mind raced, realizing that isolation, even a split second, was an invitation for the lagoon to strike. This rule wasn't about convenience, it was a literal lifeline. By evening we resurfaced together, bodies trembling, gasping for air, aware of the lagoon's watchful patience. Rule 7 had kept us alive, yet I knew it was only temporary. The water had tested our attention and unity, and the next challenge would be even more precise, more punishing. Harris and I sat silently on the dock, staring at the darkening lagoon, each of us aware that any future mistakes could be final. The water waited, patient and eternal, ready to exploit the smallest lapse in vigilance. Obedience to the rules wasn't enough, we had to embody them fully, or the lagoon would remind us why it demanded compliance. The morning after surviving the isolation test of Rule 7, the lagoon seemed almost serene, deceptively calm, yet I could feel its gaze on us. Harris and I moved along the shoreline cautiously, both of us aware that the water was observing, calculating, waiting. Rule 8. Never underestimate the lagoon's patience. It waits for mistakes like a predator stalks its prey, echoed in my mind like a hammer. The lagoon's patience was deadly. It did not need to strike immediately. It waited for fear, distraction, or exhaustion to break the rules. I realized that complacency could be just as dangerous as curiosity, and every step we took demanded vigilance. Even the simplest movements were scrutinized. A leaf floated past us, carried by a subtle current, and I paused, remembering Rule 8. The lagoon didn't reveal its intentions quickly. It toyed with those who disrespected its patience, bending time and perception to its will. Harris, already tense from previous encounters, flinched as a shadow crossed beneath the surface, moving in perfect synchronization with the leaves above. It's just water," he muttered nervously. But I shook my head, knowing better. The lagoon's patience allowed it to shape moments into traps, and we were navigating a field of invisible snares. Hours passed with careful observation, each ripple and shadow requiring our attention. I could sense the water testing us subtly, changing temperature, shifting currents, whispering faintly, all while maintaining an illusion of calm. Rule 8 reminded me that danger here wasn't always immediate. It could linger for hours, days, or even weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. I glanced at Harris, whose hands trembled slightly, and knew that fatigue was already beginning to gnaw at his focus. The lagoon thrived on such weakness, and I forced us both to remain vigilant, repeating Rule 8 in my head like a mantra. As the sun sank low, the water pulsed unnaturally beneath our feet. Currents shifted, shadows twisted, and the surface reflected shapes that didn't exist. I tightened my grip on Harris, whispering, "Stay focused. Rule 8 isn't just about patience, it's about surviving the long game." I could feel the lagoon's awareness as a weight pressing down from below, a reminder that it never forgot, never forgave. One lapse, one misstep, and the patient predator would strike with precision and finality. We moved as slowly and deliberately as possible, each step an act of respect for the deadly intelligence beneath. By twilight, the lagoon's testing intensified. A sudden warmth passed beneath my legs, almost imperceptible, followed by a chill that made my teeth chatter. Shadows swirled in patterns meant to distract, confuse, and lure us toward mistakes. Rule 8 screamed in my mind, "It waits, always for the moment you let your guard down." I forced Harris to acknowledge the shifts with me, to double-check every step, every gesture, every glance toward the water. The lagoon was patient, and we were painfully aware that any misjudgment now could cost everything we had survived. Even when we thought we were safe on the dock, I could sense it, the subtle movement of water that had no natural source, a quiet, deliberate ripple that tested our focus. Harris looked at me, pale, whispering, how long does it wait?" I swallowed hard, voice low, "Until we break." That's why Rule 8 exists. The lagoon's patience was part of its power. It didn't need to act openly. It could bide its time, shaping fear and fatigue, until the perfect moment to strike arrived. The water pulsed beneath us, slow and deliberate, a reminder that the endgame was always coming. By nightfall, the lagoon seemed calm again, though I knew better. Its patience was infinite, and Rule 8 had tested not only our caution, but our endurance. Harris and I sat silently on the dock, watching shadows stretch across the surface, knowing that our vigilance had only postponed the inevitable challenge. The lagoon waited, unblinking, inexorable, and I could feel the weight of the final rule pressing down before we had even reached it. One last test remained, and I knew it would push us beyond everything we had endured so far. The morning air was heavy with tension, thick and damp, as the lagoon reflected an unnerving stillness, almost like it was holding its breath. Harris and I approached the edge of the water, both of us exhausted from surviving the first 8 rules, knowing that Rule 9, never leave the lagoon willingly. It decides when a diver can go, and leaving on your own terms it's impossible, was the ultimate test. I could feel the lagoon pulsing beneath me, patient and intelligent, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment since our arrival. The water looked calm, inviting even, but I knew better. The lagoon didn't release its prey by choice. Leaving was not a decision we could make. It was dictated entirely by its will, and any thought of walking away on our own could provoke consequences beyond comprehension. I glanced at Harris, whose face was pale and drawn, and I whispered, "This is it. Rule 9 isn't just a rule, it's the final boundary." The water's surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting shapes and shadows that weren't real. I remembered every warning I had read, every story of divers who had tried to escape before the lagoon allowed it, only to vanish or return broken. The lagoon tested patience, obedience, perception, and fear, but this final rule demanded absolute surrender to its control. I realized the depth of the danger. Even if we obeyed everything perfectly, the lagoon decided if we survived or not. We prepared to enter the water one last time, carefully tethered to each other, hearts pounding. I repeated Rule 9 like a prayer, knowing that our fate depended on total submission. The water greeted us like an old knowing adversary, shifting gently beneath our feet, teasing us with a false sense of safety. I could feel it weighing our intentions, reading our minds, and calculating the slightest flicker of doubt or defiance. Harris swallowed hard, eyes wide, and muttered, "I've never felt anything like this." I nodded, voice low, "It knows everything. Rule 9 proves it." As we submerged, the water enveloped us like a living thing, pressing lightly at first, then tightening with an invisible hand that seemed to measure our fear. Every motion felt amplified, every thought accessible, and I realized that Rule 9 was not a warning, it was the lagoon asserting dominance. Shadows slid beneath us, stretching unnaturally, testing whether we would panic or obey. I could hear faint whispers in the depths, familiar voices from our pasts, calling us toward the forbidden zones, attempting to break our concentration. I forced myself to repeat Rule 9, keeping our focus locked on survival, knowing that a single falter could mean the end. Hours passed as we navigated carefully, tethered together, aware that the lagoon's patience had no limits. Currents shifted subtly, water temperature oscillated, and reflections teased us with impossible distortions, all designed to make us act against the rule. I could feel the water testing our resolve, and every time I glanced at Harris, I saw him teetering on the edge of fear and curiosity. Rule 9 reminded me that leaving the lagoon prematurely was an illusion. We could only follow its terms. It was a predator, omniscient and calculating, and survival required surrendering entirely to its will. A sudden warmth swept past my legs, followed by a chilling current, and I instinctively pulled Harris closer. Shadows coalesced beneath us, twisting into forms I didn't recognize, yet I dared not look directly. Rule 9 pulsed in my mind: never act against the lagoon's flow, never resist its judgment. Harris whispered, almost inaudibly, "It feels like it's alive." I nodded, gripping him tighter, my chest tight with fear. "It is alive, and it decides everything here. Rule 9 keeps us breathing." The lagoon tested us relentlessly, pressing our endurance, patience, and obedience to their limits. Time lost meaning as we moved deeper, currents pushing and pulling in deliberate patterns. The shadows seemed to anticipate our every motion, moving as if they were extensions of the lagoon itself. I focused on Rule 9, repeating it like a shield in my mind, while Harris struggled against the hypnotic pull of the water, the illusions, the whispers. The lagoon was patient, omnipotent, and relentless, and I realized with chilling certainty that one wrong decision, one moment of defiance, could erase us from existence entirely. It measured our thoughts, our fears, our trust in each other, and I could feel the weight of its judgment pressing down relentlessly. As darkness fell beneath the water, shapes swirled around us, reflections warped impossibly, currents coiled in unnatural spirals. I could sense the lagoon's awareness sharpening, waiting to see if we would falter. Every instinct screamed to panic, yet Rule 9 anchored me. Leaving prematurely was not allowed, and even thinking about it invited danger. Harris trembled beside me, eyes wide, whispering, "Do you think it will ever let us go?" I swallowed hard, voice strained. "We don't get to decide. Rule 9 decides, and we follow." The lagoon seemed to respond, pulsing with a rhythm that felt alive, deliberate, and intelligent. Hours or maybe minutes later, we found ourselves near the familiar markers, the depth lines, the dock, and the edges, where safety felt almost tangible. I knew this was the lagoon testing our attention to the end, measuring whether obedience could survive exhaustion, fear, and doubt. Rule 9 had been the ultimate test, teaching us that survival was not about courage, skill, or intelligence. It was about surrender, submission, and unwavering respect. I felt the weight of its patience, the depth of its awareness, and the quiet knowledge that the lagoon remembered everything we had done. Finally, we reached the shallows, hearts pounding, bodies trembling, aware that the lagoon had allowed us to surface. I glanced at Harris, who avoided my gaze, pale and silent, and whispered, We survived." I shook my head slowly, voice low. It decided to let us go. Rule 9 isn't about choice, it's about obedience. The lagoon's surface rippled gently, calm once more, yet I could feel its presence, patient and eternal, waiting for the next mistake, the next diver, the next test. I knew we were lucky. The rules had kept us alive, but survival was never guaranteed again. As we climbed onto the dock, exhausted, shivering, and grateful to be breathing, I realized that the lagoon didn't forgive, didn't forget, and certainly didn't care about intention. The Rules 9 in total had been our lifeline, each one interlocking, demanding vigilance, fear, and discipline. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and the Black Lagoon would have claimed us, silently and without remorse. I stared at the water, a cold certainty in my chest, knowing that the rules were alive, waiting, and that we were only allowed to leave because the lagoon decided it was time, not because we wanted to. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.